Shrewd Manager Christianity's position. The dimensions of the shroud are deliberate. Non-partisan sources show that units used in the ancient Near East closely fit these dimensions. The shroud is made of two lengthwise strips of cloth, one wide and one narrow. At the seam, the weaving pattern of the strips match. This points to the two strips being produced at the same time on the same loom. Both strips have selvages, which is an edge produced on woven fabric during manufacture that prevents it from unraveling. Although the shroud is not a perfect rectangle, it is surprisingly uniform, considering it is handmade, at least 650 years old, has been stored without climate controls, was burned, soaked, folded, displayed, and handled many times. Here are 6 measurements of the shroud or the backing cloth attached to it. These come from a website that argues the shroud is medieval. Despite the slight differences, they all show a nearly perfect ratio of 4 units long by 1 unit wide. When we average them, we come up with a size of 438 by 112 centimeters. Deduction. The finished size of the cloth is deliberate. If a narrower cloth was sufficient, we'd see a selvage here instead of a seam. If a wider sheet was the goal, the weaver could have joined wider strips. The 4-to-1 ratio supports this conclusion that the size is deliberate. In shroud studies, there are really only 2 positions on the shroud's age. It existed in 1st century Palestine or 14th century Europe. The question is, what unit of measurement from either time divides evenly into both 438 and 112 centimeters? Search medieval weights and measures. I selected 2 Wikipedia articles that are unrelated to the shroud. This chart shows a dozen units from throughout the region. The deviations for some are significant. A high deviation means the shroud was not likely made to that scale. The 2 closest are the Spanish foot and the English ell. For ancient units, I chose a book from 1877, Inductive Metrology by Flinders Petrie. From dimensions of buildings and monuments throughout the world, Petrie calculated units of measurement they were built to. He noticed some nearly identical units used in ancient Persia, Assyria, and Egypt. He didn't know what to call these units, but he knew the math worked. When he compared his findings to the work of an earlier researcher named Julius Oppert, Petrie saw that 3 of his units were a near-perfect match to what Oppert called an Assyrian cubit. Oppert identified measurements not from monuments, but from inscriptions and other literary remains. So we have 4 nearly identical results derived from 2 independent methods. This combined evidence covers the Neo-Assyrian period into the Second Temple period, Jesus' era. Perhaps it shouldn't surprise us that cultures that traded with one another and shared a lingua franca, Aramaic and later Greek, would also share units of measurements. Now back to our chart. Here are the 4 Petrie-Oppert results converted to centimeters. The average of the 4 fits into the shroud dimensions with very little deviation. To sum up, to be Jesus' burial cloth, the shroud must have existed in ancient Palestine. We reasoned from the shroud that its length and width were made to the same scale. What scale? We found 3, one of which comes from the ancient Near East. So this is compatible with our other findings that the cloth fits the Gospels. Of course, ancient cloth wouldn't prove the image is ancient. Like new paint on an old building, the image could have been added much later. But it would impute a lot of foresight to a medieval forger or artist to first locate a 50-square-foot expensive ancient cloth. Next, we conclude this series with a summary of our findings.